Welcome to today's deep dive into the source material. I'm your host, and today we are digging into something that really completely shifts how we view history.
Hi, everyone. I'm the resident historian for the show, and I'm very excited about this one because it challenges a lot of our basic assumptions.
Yeah, totally. So our mission today is to look at the Protestant Reformation, but we're specifically analyzing historical records on the Protestant Reform continues. That's AP, European History Topic 2.3, for those tracking the sources.
Right, looking at everything from the technological catalysts to the specific political splinter groups that rose up.
And the hook here, the thing that really grabbed me, is that we always hear about this as a religious event. You know, theology, grace,
The
indulgences.
Sunday school version.
Exactly. But looking at these sources, it argues that this was equally a technological and political revolution, like a massive tech disruption.
It really was. I mean, we are talking about a massive shift in authority and control. Between 1450 and 1648, the printing press completely destabilized the power structures of Europe.
Okay, to set the stage for you, the listener, I want you to picture a map of Europe in the year 1500. If you color-code it by religious authority, it is essentially a solid block of color.
A total monolith. From Italy up to Scandinavia over to England, it's the Roman Catholic Church. One hierarchy, one spiritual boss.
Right, one boss. But then you fast forward just 150 years to 1648, and you look at that same map, and it looks like someone dropped a stained glass window on the floor.
It's completely shattered.
Shattered. You got Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, Anabaptists, and the borders are basically drawn in blood.
Which brings us to the technological catalyst, because as the sources point out, Martin Luther was not the first person to have these reformist ideas.
No, not at all. We have a clear control group in the historical record.
Hmm?
You look back at guys like John Wycliffe in England in the 1300s or Jan Hus in Bohemia.
They were saying the exact same things. The church is corrupt, the hierarchy has too much power, the people need the Bible.
But they lacked a critical advantage, so Wycliffe gets suppressed, and Jan Hus literally gets burned at the stake.
And their movements basically die with them.
Right, so why didn't they trigger the revolution? And it comes down to the tech. Pre-press, if you're Wycliffe and you write a tract criticizing the Pope, how do you distribute it?
You have to hand copy it, which is agonizingly slow.
Agonizingly slow, yeah.
And because it's so slow, containment by the authorities is easy. If the bishop wants to stop your movement, he just sends soldiers to seize the, 20 copies you managed to make.
He burns the books, he burns you, end of story. The church had a total monopoly on distribution.
Exactly. But then, around 1450, the game changer arrives. Gutenberg gets the movable type printing press working. And suddenly, ideas can outpace suppression.
The math completely changes. The cost to produce a book plummets, but more importantly, the speed of reproduction increases by hundreds.
When Luther posts his 95 Theses in 1517, he isn't relying on scribes. He sends it to a printer.
And it goes viral.
Completely viral. Within a couple of weeks, it's all over Germany. By the time the church officials even held a meeting to discuss what to do about him, there were thousands of copies of his ideas already out there.
They were trying to put the smoke back in the bottle. And we should detail exactly what was being printed, because I think you picture, like, giant, heavy Bibles.
Right, but the sources emphasize short-form writings. Pamphlets, broadsides, sermons.
The 16th century equivalent of a viral tweet.
Exactly. Short, provocative, and often featuring woodcut cartoons so even illiterate laypeople could understand the arguments.
Which is huge, because for the first time, you have literate and even semi-literate laypeople actively engaged in debate, rather than just passively sitting in a pew listening to a priest.
Which perfectly sets up the next massive shift, the language revolution, the vernacular scripture.
Yes, because up until this point, the church maintains centralized control by keeping the Bible in Latin.
The Latin monopoly. It essentially restricted all interpretation to a highly educated clergy elite. If you're a regular person, you can't access the divine text yourself.
You're completely dependent on the priest. You have to trust his interpretation.
And the reformers step in and say, no, we are democratizing the divine. Luther translates the New Testament into German.
Which popularized personal scripture reading in a way no one had ever seen.
And it spreads. The sources note the French translation of the New Testament in 1523.
And then the English translation in 1526, which drastically expanded access in England.
Tyndale's translation, yes, which was incredibly dangerous to do.
Right, that's the aha moment for me in these sources. The magnitude of this shift is incredible. You are entirely bypassing the priest to read the text directly.
And by doing that, you completely weaken the church's interpretive monopoly.
But once you do that, once people start reading and interpreting for themselves, they don't just stop at challenging the church, do they?
No, they do not. Because in this era, secular state power and religious church power are deeply intertwined.
So we move from the theological fracture straight into the political fracture.
Once you challenge the religious authority, the political authority is next. The sources break this down into a really helpful spectrum, starting with the top-down reform.
The Anglican exception.
Right, Henry VIII in England.
Which is such a wild story because Henry didn't even like the Protestant theology.
He hated Luther,
Yeah.
but he needed a divorce, and the Pope said no. So Henry creates a political break from Rome,
He makes himself the monarch and the head of the church.
the supreme head. But the nuance the sources highlight is that early Anglican practices remained very Catholic-like.
Yeah, the liturgy, the aesthetics. It was basically Catholicism without the Pope, so Henry could be the boss.
It was a power grab. But that's the top-down version. The real chaos was the bottom-up resistance.
The spectrum of dissent. And the sources list several specific groups we need to walk through to see how varied this resistance was. Let's start with the Calvinists.
The Calvinists are crucial. They wanted to fundamentally purify the church of any Catholic remnants. But politically, they vehemently resisted state control over religion.
They didn't want the king telling them how to worship, which leads right into the Puritans in England.
Exactly. The Puritans specifically opposed the Stuart monarchs. They pushed for much stricter reforms than the Anglican Church was offering, which ultimately fuels massive civil unrest.
And then across the channel, you have the Huguenots in France.
French Calvinists, they were resisting a very strongly centralized Catholic monarchy.
And it essentially creates a state within a state. They had their own fortified towns.
Which led to incredible violence. But
Yeah.
then you have a really unique example in the sources, the Polish nobles.
I found this part fascinating.
It's a great nuance. The Polish nobility used the reform movement to seek religious freedom specifically as a tool against state authority.
Right, they adopted Protestantism so the Catholic king couldn't consolidate absolute power over them. Religion as a political shield.
Precisely. But if we're talking about the absolute extreme end of this spectrum of dissent, we have to talk about the Anabaptists.
The Anabaptists, these guys scared everybody.
Catholics and Protestants both hunted them because the Anabaptists advocated for the total separation of church and state.
Which in the 1500s was a completely radical, almost anarchic idea.
They refused to baptize infants, meaning you weren't registered with the state church apparatus, and they refused military service.
Pacifists who wouldn't swear oaths to the local prince.
To the political authorities, that's not just heresy, that is treason.
So we have all these groups, this massive fracture. Let's look at the social and political impact of all this between 1450 and 1648. Starting with the good news, the educational shift.
Right, because there's this new spiritual emphasis on reading the Bible yourself. Lay literacy rates just skyrocketed.
You had to know how to read to save your soul.
Exactly. And this brings us to the end of the monopoly. We enter an era of religious pluralism.
If the Catholic Church no longer holds the monopoly, you have multiple denominations existing at once.
But we have to explain the dark side of this transition because it was not peaceful.
No, the cost of change was total destabilization.
You have civil unrest everywhere. Groups refusing state authority, like the Puritans in England, directly fueled the English Civil War.
And on the continent, you have the wars of religion, widespread European violence.
The French wars of religion were incredibly brutal. And then, of course, the big one, the 30 Years' War.
Right, from 1618 to 1648.
It devastated Central Europe. We are talking about massive casualties, famine, disease. Whole regions were depopulated because these fragmented political and religious groups were fighting for absolute survival.
So to synthesize all this, what started as a theological debate, amplified by a new piece of technology, turned into a full-blown revolution that totally redefined the relationship between the individual, the church, and the state.
That's exactly it. The Reformation set the precedent for civil resistance to centralized authority.
It's the journey from the printing press to the vernacular Bible, leading directly to the fracture of European power structures.
And the ultimate takeaway from these sources is that personal access to information proved to be more important and more powerful than institutional control.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We've seen how the printing press shattered the unified worldview of 16th century Europe by giving individuals raw access to information, right?
Right, bypassing the gatekeepers.
And passing the gatekeepers. So looking at our world today with the internet and social media, Does widespread access to information inevitably lead to massive instability and conflict before it can lead to a new equilibrium?
That is a phenomenal question. Are we in our own modern version of the wars of religion?
Something to think about as you scroll your feeds today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the historical sources. We will catch you in the next one.